Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to jump right into our discussion with Milinda Ysasi and Dave Rapaport from Ben & Jerry's here in a moment. But I just want to take a moment to welcome you all on behalf of People First Economy and our programs Local First and Good for Michigan. We're so honored to be able to have a discussion with Dave from Ben & Jerry's about workforce well-being and how businesses and our communities thrive when we put people first. I'd like to acknowledge some of our partners in this work. We have the American Sustainable Business Council, Michigan Economic Development Corporation, the Ann Arbor Ypsilanti Regional Chamber of Commerce, Southeast Michigan Sustainable Business Forum, the University of Michigan Center for Positive Organizations, and the Grand Rapids Economics Club helping us broadcast this today. And our sponsors, Brewery Vivant and Broadleaf Local Beer, Comcast Business Class, DTE Energy, Switchback Gear Exchange, Revalue, Northern Michigan College of Business, the University of Michigan Credit Union, Northern Initiatives, and This Is Worthwhile. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our incredible moderator for today's discussion. She is a pillar in Grand Rapids, Michigan, as not only one of our city commissioners, the first Latina city commissioner, also the founding director of The Source, which is an organization focused on reducing employment barriers and creating opportunities for mobility for employees that work for their partner organizations. The Source began as an idea by local CEOs that wanted to care for their workforce and retain talent in their companies. In the coming weeks, Milinda will also transition to become the CEO of Grand Rapids Opportunities for Women, an organization focusing on increasing equitable access to capital for entrepreneurs in the West Michigan region. She also has an extensive background in corporate HR, serving some of Michigan's most prominent employers, and is the co-founder of the Latina Network of West Michigan. Milinda, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Hannah. I appreciate it. I'm so excited to be here today to kick off Monday with this amazing conversation and all of you. Great to hear some Second Ward sponsors in that lineup. So, as we set the stage for today, I think, there has been so much conversation really over the last probably 2 years, 18 months about, this discourse that we're having sometimes on social media prior to COVID in coffee shops, but certainly in things like our Instagram pages. And when we hear from Dave today and we hear about the work that Ben & Jerry's has been doing, this is not something that they just started a few years ago or last month or last summer. Their work is really focused on making sure that business is a force for good and making sure that the work that they engage with is not performative, but it's really about true social change. So before we get started, let me introduce you to Dave a little bit. We've had a chance to chat behind the scenes, and I'm so excited to welcome here to Grand Rapids virtually. So Dave Rapaport is the Global Social Mission Officer for Ben & Jerry's, leading the iconic Vermont-based ice cream company's commitment to being a force for good through their day-to-day operations and their value chain. They do this by using their influence as a business through activism campaigns, you've probably seen them on Instagram, promoting progressive social change, with racial equity as being a major component of this work. But Dave has been doing this work for a very long time. He's been a mission-driven activist for more than 30 years, spanning both business, nonprofit, and government sectors. Prior to Ben & Jerry's, he was the vice president of Earth and Community Care for Aveda. That's a pretty dope title, where he worked across the business to help drive the pioneer prestige beauty company's mission to care for the world. He also had several leadership positions with the Green Household Care Products pioneer, 7th generation. This is all stuff we can find in our kitchen in our homes, right, that Dave has worked on. But he has also been involved with business and project management as it related to renewable energy. And before the business world, Dave spent 2 decades in the public policy arena in roles such as executive director of the Vermont Public Interest Research Group and also with Greenpeace. So today we're going to be hearing not only the story of Ben & Jerry's, but really taking the expertise and experiences that Dave has had and sharing them here in Grand Rapids. So welcome, Dave.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thanks.
Thanks so much. So let's just go ahead and get started with our conversation. We've got a number of great questions that have been worked up by the team, as well as some ones later on from our community. So And prepping for this, I actually thought back to my first job was at an ice cream shop here here in the Grand Rapids area. So I thought back to those days. But our first question is: think about those early days of Ben and Jerry's, and what were the business relationship to the community. So tell us a bit of that origin story of Ben and Jerry's.
Sure. Well, Ben and Jerry were childhood friends, and I think they'd done a number of things, together and individually, and decided they wanted to hang out together, and they enjoyed food. And so it really is true. They took this male correspondence course in ice cream, and they put together a scoop shop in Burlington that was originally in an old converted gas station. And they were really dedicated to making the best ice cream they could. But after a couple of years, they realized it was not really that they were just hanging out together and eating ice cream. They were having to do all the things that business people have to do to make their businesses run. And I think Ben, as I understand it from him, was really ready to just let it go and sell the business after about 3 years, because it wasn't what he wanted to be doing. And he was talking to sort of a friend mentor of his, and his friend said, if you don't like the way business is, why don't you change the way business is run? And so he sort of took that to heart, and from that moment on, the Ben and Jerry's business really became a mission in around changing the nature of business, and in using that business to be who Ben and Jerry wanted to be in the world, and to make the change in the world that they wanted to see. And so things really took off, from there. Not necessarily, just one smooth glide, but all the challenges that businesses face. But gradually over time, that approach really turned out to be not only successful in various ways to make a difference in the community and in the world, but it turned out to be a good way to build a business as well.
Great. And I listened to a few podcasts, one that you were in, Dave, over the weekend too, just in preparation, as well as eating ice cream. But the story is also there's been some good partnerships too, right? With Grayston Bakery, which is an organization that I follow. Can you share a little bit about them?
Yeah, no, that's a great partnership, and really in many ways a flagship for what the power of business can do. Grayston Bakery was founded by a guy named Bernie Glassman, who actually was a Buddhist monk, and as well as having an interesting background, prior to that, which had nothing to do with spirituality. But what he saw was that so many people, because of their backgrounds, whether it was drug addiction problems, prison, or whatever else it was, just not being employed, were having a hard time getting work, and that these barriers were really very difficult for people to overcome. So he kind of pioneered this whole new model called open hiring, which in essence reverses the way we typically think about hiring. When you hire employees, typically what we do is we put a lot of resources, time and money behind the recruitment and evaluation process when people apply. And then we throw them into a job, and it either works or it doesn't work. What Grayston Bakery does is they just simply have a sign-up list. And when your name comes up, if you want a job, you got a job. And so there is absolutely no selection process. Instead, the resources and energy are put into helping that person succeed. If they don't, then they don't. But what that has been is transformative for people, providing opportunities that they never would have had. And Grayston has provided and created thousands of jobs over their history. Grayston makes all the brownies in chocolate fudge brownie, and half baked, and now blonde brownies in a number of flavors. And it's really a terrific success story, so much so that they've actually created the Open Hiring Institute, which really is spreading this gospel of this open hiring approach, and helping businesses that want to use it figure out how to work with it.
Thanks so much for sharing that. I think it's important, you mentioned in your bio and the conversation, it's not just what you do, but it's part of your value chain. So making sure that your value chain exhibits, what you believe in is key. And I know They have like a childcare facility, which is a major issue here in Michigan and really across the country as we look at the pandemic. So thank you for sharing that. Let's talk a little bit more about sort of the internal work. So your role at Ben& Jerry's is really to use the company's influence and impact to create a progressive social change, hopefully in our world and our communities. Talk to us a little bit about what are some of those policies, practices that you and your team have put in place with the company that you believe have been effective in making a positive impact on your workforce.
Well, I think first and foremost, people really appreciate working for a company that has a true, meaningful purpose to try to create change in the world. More and more, and you see this with young millennials and especially now Gen Z, people want to be able to express their values not just in their off time, but at work. And so feeling like they're a part of making positive change is a really valuable thing, for any workforce. We know, and there's lots of studies that demonstrate that this really helps with every step of the way, from recruitment to performance to retention. And so I'd say that the biggest thing is that people really enjoy working for a company that is trying to make change in the world. And there are all kinds of things, of course, that have a more direct impact, on the workforce. One of the things that one of the ways we describe our business model is around the idea of linked prosperity. So enabling everybody who our business touches to share in the success of our business. And from the employee standpoint, we ensure that wherever they are in the world, employees are earning at least a livable or living wage. And we do a calculation wherever the geographies are. So, in our manufacturing plants in Vermont, the starting salary is over $18 an hour as a result of that. And so, those are things that are obviously very meaningful in a direct way. And I think that people enjoy being a part of all of the different ways that we are trying to have a positive influence, whether it's through volunteering activities in the community, or whether it is going to a demonstration, say at the State House or down in Washington, D.C., that is working for the kinds of positive, progressive changes that we're seeking.
That's wonderful. I think when you think about the fact that we work and sometimes we see the people in our workplaces more than we see our own family, you really do want to make sure that what you're doing, your time and energy, is for something that is values aligned, is something that you can see, hopefully that impact, maybe that day, and maybe it's going to be years from now. So I think that was a real point when you think about the future of work. It's benefits, it's pay, but it's also, can I be proud to say, maybe put this on my LinkedIn page to share with my family and friends that I work at this particular business. I know, when you think about some of those internal pieces, do you see anything as it relates to your retention of your employees or reduction in your turnover? Do you all track that as it relates to some of your initiatives with your workforce?
Well, it's really hard to tie, things like retention or turnover to particular specific causes, but we do have a very low turnover, very high retention rate, and so certainly I think a part of it is that people really love and value being a part of Ben& Jerry's, and there's a lot of different factors I think to that. But this issue of sort of tying the social mission to the performance of the business is an interesting one. We very consciously don't do that. Because we think it's the story I told early on with Ben deciding not to sell the company because it could be a force for the things that he wanted to do in the world, he and Jerry. What that means is that Ben& Jerry's would not exist if we weren't trying to make those changes in the world. Mm-hmm. And we're really an activist organization that sells ice cream. We sell ice cream to do those things that we do, and we know that it does have a lot of powerful effects in terms of business benefits. But we also know that the minute we started to do those things for that purpose, it would lose the magic. the reason why people are attracted to being at Ben & Jerry's and working there, and for those who are attracted to our ice cream because of the things we do, is because they know that it's genuine, it's authentic, that we're doing it for the real purpose of making positive change. And so we really stay away from trying to measure the success of those efforts based on business success. For example, if we're working around a social justice issue, the measure is actually winning that issue. It's not at all tied to any of those other metrics, which we know come along as sort of happy byproducts, but are not the reason why we do them.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Dave. I think that is the absolute piece that I wanted you to share because, this is a journey for a lot of businesses and organizations and community, and to see, maybe you start out somewhere, but really what is that ultimate goal? So we talked a little bit origin story internally. Let's talk legislative. Let's talk external. So what sort of legislative policies have you advocated for in the last year? And how do you select those priorities? How do you make sure, what are the things that you're going to give your time and energy and your influence to?
Well, the things that we work on really come out of the sort of values that originated with our co-founders. Today, we describe them in sort of three buckets that are very much overlapping. There's human rights and dignity, social and economic justice, and environmental protection, restoration, and regeneration. And so all of the things we do within the social mission, whether it is internal around the direct impacts we have as a business, the sustainability things that we work on, the work that we do on our value-led sourcing programs, say with dairy or with cocoa, or whether it's the external activism that we do, all kind of derive from those values. And over time, we've worked on a lot of things. What we have realized over time is that to be effective in really winning change, we really need to focus. That's something we all learn about everything we do, right? The more you can actually focus most of your efforts on a limited set of priorities, the more effective you're going to be. And also, it takes longevity. Change is not easy or won over a short period of time. So we've kind of gravitated toward having priority areas of focus across the markets that we serve. So here in the U.S., it is racial equity work, primarily focused on criminal justice reform. In Europe, it is refugee and asylum rights. In some parts of the world, and Australia, New Zealand, and a few others, it's climate change. And we work on LGBTQ issues in a number of places as well. And of course, we work on more than just those things, but those are the major areas of focus. So here in the U.S., we're supporting the BREATHE Act, which is legislation introduced by Rashida Tlaib and Ayanna Pressley in the House that really looks at divesting from many of the failed systems around public safety and policing that have not worked, and investing instead in a new kind of public safety that avoids many of the problems that people are out in the streets, this very day, concerned about these injustices. And we're working for HR 40, the act that would establish a commission to study reparations for slavery, and the MORE Act, which is the legislation that would decriminalize marijuana possession and create amnesty and expungement for those who were previously convicted of marijuana crimes, because we know that Black people, people of color, have been disproportionately impacted by really a set of laws that were part of the framework of systemic racism that folks are now trying to work to overturn. So those are some of the things that we're currently working on.
That's great. So if all those things in our audience resonate with you, that means you should go buy some ice cream later today. Maybe a couple of pints, right? So that can continue to sell that ice cream to do this activism work. I do want to do a follow-up to this question, Dave. How do you at all, so you talked about the priorities and being very specific. So you've got this focus. So because I think it being a long game, it can get very tiring. We're not going to see the change happen overnight. And so I think that was key that you mentioned that. But does Ben & Jerry's incorporate, your workforce's voice or the ideas that they have or something that they want to champion when you think about, those future policy priorities?
Well, the policy priorities really, come out of this sort of history and heritage that we have. And well, we all talk about it as employees, and of course, we welcome lots of voices in those conversations. The way that Ben and Jerry's is set up is after the acquisition, or as a part of the acquisition by Unilever, an independent board of directors was created that really are stewards of that social mission. They are mandated in the acquisition agreement to protect and advance the social mission. And so everything that we do really is um, approved by that board of directors, and a lot of the things we do reflect the values of that board, which really were put in place to sort of perpetuate the heritage of those values that our co-founders had. It's a board that's made up primarily of activists, and so that's sort of the way that it works at Ben and Jerry's. But there are certainly ideas that come up from employees about particular things to become involved with. It might be a community activity or a volunteer program. A lot of our employees are really engaged with an organization in Vermont called Spectrum Youth Services, which does all kinds of wonderful things for extremely at-risk youth. So there's a lot of ways in which employee ideas about things to become involved with, can come to fruition.
Wonderful. Well, when we think about Michigan and Vermont, we have a couple things in common. We like to talk about our weather, probably, the closeness that we have to the Canadian border, but probably also just having unique political and economic landscapes, right? And so here in Michigan, that is truly how we see ourselves. We've been in the news a lot, the state, over the last 18 months, obviously with COVID and a kidnapping attack against our governor. So we've been in the news. And so knowing that we have this unique economic and political landscape, there are challenges and opportunities, right? And I like to think of myself as an eternal optimist, like what can we get out of this challenge? But in your role at Ben and Jerry's, or in any really of the previous roles, you've really worked at a number of organizations that are doing this work. Have you observed any state or local level legislation that's been particularly effective in setting up companies to be a force for good?
Well, certainly one thinks about the benefit corporation legislation, which I think has been enacted in nearly 40 states, and there is under consideration in a number of others. So benefit corporations, the idea is that it's a different way, it's a different charter for establishing corporation that enables the company to look beyond just the interests of shareholders and into a wider range of stakeholders, to value more than just maximizing profit for stockholders. There's all kinds of benefit corporations that run the spectrum in terms of political beliefs and values. But the thing they have in common is that they're all incorporated to have some type of a public benefit, and they're enabled through that legislation to do so. So that's, I think, been very instrumental in allowing companies to sort of set off to do things that previously they faced limitations on. And so that's certainly one thing that first comes to mind.
Okay. Well, and it's, and it really across, obviously legislation takes time. And so the businesses you're working with often are the ones who are moving forward and saying, we can do this, and then hopefully to make more systemic change to have that legislation enacted, right? So you don't need the legislation to start, right? You can start on your own and then hopefully be part of that change, on a local level or a state level. So thanks for sharing that.
Absolutely. You don't need that. That can be instrumental. But, you think about, we as people, as individuals, we're driven by all kinds of things, right? I mean, we all have a need for sort of security and there's the sense of sort of financial security, but there's all kinds of other things that drive us too. Our altruistic sides, our desire to help people, to sort of live in harmony. And for too long, businesses have been sort of given a pass. We've been told by Milton Friedman and others that the only purpose of a company is to maximize the value for shareholders, and everything else will take care of itself. And of course, we know that actually hasn't happened. It doesn't. It's just given us a pass to pretend that we didn't have to worry about those things. When we're on the thing that we're spending most of our time and energy on at work. And when you think about it, it's kind of ridiculous. So bringing your values to work is increasingly important to everybody, and bringing your values to the market, the grocery store, is increasingly important to everybody. And I think that what we're seeing is the beginnings of a real movement to change the world by recognizing, that we have to incorporate all those multidimensional values across everything we do, and young people are demanding it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, it wouldn't be a people first event or any event on a Monday morning without a good quote, right? So you have been quoted as saying, "Work is too long and purchases are too precious to not be meaningful." And, as we prep for this, I thought, you're absolutely right. And the work of here in Grand Rapids of People First has been to continue to ask ourselves that question. What could we do, not only ourselves, but how could we, as a coalition of businesses, of individuals, how can we maximize our impact? That's what I always think. Like, how can we have this maximizing effect with our small businesses and others in the community? So knowing that that's a quote from you, what does the increased influence of conscious consumerism, or this idea of that, we're voting or buying with our dollar, mean for businesses that are looking to align their practices with their values and really the values of their customer?
Well, for us, it really isn't looking to align with our values, or align our values with the values of our customers. I think that's been perhaps a mistake that many businesses have made over the past decade or two. This idea of cause-related marketing. What we do is very different than that. We start with our values, and we do things aligned with those values, and we're able to form really close relationships with people who share those values. So Ben Cohen actually said the closest relationship you can have with your consumer is over shared values, and so we think that's really the way to do it. So we don't start out trying to figure out where they are. We know where we are. We do what we do, and people who share those values, gravitate towards us. And so I would say, for any business thinking about how to sort of, put this into action, it's start with something that's important to you. Start with something that's really meaningful. Figure out what kind of change you really want to make in the world. Figure out the tools you have at your disposal to do it, and go after it. And it can be, and often, there are lots of ways that those things can tie into a company's products and services, but it doesn't have to. I mean, the things that I've been talking about have very little directly to do with ice cream. And so it can work either way, but it starts with really being serious about trying to do something in the world.
That's great. I think this, especially now when we are, sort of at home more with COVID, I know for ourselves, like my family and others around me, just taking that time to say, okay, if we know that this is important to me, I can no longer go to this business. I can no longer buy these, this food item, or, something that has happened that says, I have to make a conscious choice. And if I'm going to be about it, I'm going to be about it all the way. So I think that's absolutely key when we think about the dollars that we spend. So let's talk a little about one of those buckets, the area of focus for Ben and Jerry's. And so I've mentioned a couple times on my Instagram page and with friends and with family, like, you need to follow Ben and Jerry's Instagram. I have to give a shout out to my friend Cece Moore, who said, if you're not following their Instagram page, you're not part of like the conversations that are happening. And so you published a statement recently calling for the dismantling of white supremacy. Not a lot of businesses are doing that. I know that for me, that absolutely resonates. I know for many people who logged in today, they are connected because that is their shared value. So you talked a little bit about making sure that this is not marketing. This is not about trying to sell more ice cream. This is about what you believe and what you stand for. But how do you make sure that, right, you're in one particular part of the company, but how do you make sure that that resonates across an entire organization? You talked a little bit about the board, but really making sure that it's not performative, it's not marketing, but it is about the systems change.
Yeah, well, when you talk about making sure it's shared across the company, I mean, we're a company made up of all kinds of people that are representative of a wide spectrum of beliefs out there, and so it isn't that everybody necessarily always agrees with everything we do, even with inside the company, and certainly taking positions on these kinds of issues that can be controversial can be uncomfortable. I mean, this whole reckoning that we have seen over the past year, or at least beginning to see, around racism and the the legacy of slavery and the systemic ways in which me as a white man have been privileged. The things I didn't even know were going on that really had a lot to do with the success that I've enjoyed, that was built upon the backs of slaves, and the disadvantages that continued through the black codes and Jim Crow, and things like redlining, and the different kinds of access to credit and capital, the generational wealth that gets passed down to most of us who are white, as opposed to most black folks. All of these things are difficult. They're uncomfortable. They're not things that we were taught in school. And so everybody in a way is in their own personal journey, learning about these things. And not everybody is going to be at the same place at the same time. But change is uncomfortable. Those who have to change are put into discomfort, and those trying to make change are uncomfortable. So part of it is really becoming more comfortable with discomfort, and just having these conversations that we were afraid to have previously. So part of it is just being real in that way, and really just kind of taking a deep breath and doing what you think is right. But we have lots of really interesting conversations internally around these things. Even currently, we tweeted recently around defunding the police, and that has generated lots of conversation. Some pretty hateful comments to our customer service folks, but it's not new for us. We've always had those kinds of reactions from some folks, but over time, what we've seen is that more and more folks kind of get what we're talking about, and the kind of positive response we get to things like that has vastly increased over time.
Great. So we are at our last planned question, and then we'll jump into some other questions, Dave. But so you've been I think I just want to acknowledge and appreciate that you're saying what it is, not just saying we have issues in our country. No, we're talking about things like white supremacy. We're not, you're being very specific when you're talking about Black and brown indigenous people, in our society, how we have valued. You're talking about white privilege. So thank you for naming all those things. As you said, we need to get comfortable with this acknowledgement of the history of this country, and really things that have happened just in the last couple of weeks as we look at, the recent, just murder of Americans, of Black and brown men, sometimes children in this country. So thank you for saying and naming those things. So this last question is a bit more internal again, so you've been very open and honest about this is the mission, that this is an activist organization, but you've also acknowledged that while you are working towards that operation of racial equity and and taking down systems that do not create a prosperous environment for everybody and are perhaps rooted in systemic racism. You've acknowledged that it hasn't always succeeded as it relates to maybe the workforce diversity at all levels in your organization. So what does it look like to be transparent with the misses in Ben and Jerry's as well as the wins?
Well, what it looks like is saying, the facts as they are. We're still an overwhelmingly white company. Our franchise network is overwhelmingly white. I think 3% of our franchises are owned by black franchisees, and I think the same is basically true of our supply base. And so despite the fact that we have been engaging in these issues for a long time, we came out with our first statement supporting Black Lives Matter in, I think, 2015. We haven't made the progress that we need to. And we've done trainings, as many businesses have, around implicit bias and understanding institutional racism. But the work to really make change is very deep. And it starts with acknowledging that these inequities really stem from institutional racism that we have to dismantle. And understanding what those root causes are is critical. We've gone through a really interesting process over the past year, really diving deeply into the root causes that we can see, developing strategies to try to overcome them, figuring out the metrics we can use to measure the progress that we make. And that, it's not simply putting out a bunch of goals that say we're going to have a diversified, workforce that's going to reflect, say, the population of the country in 10 years or whatever it is. But it's really figuring out, how do you measure the steps along the way and whether they're leading to any meaningful change? And if you're going to have the progress that we need to make around diversity and inclusion, it really means changing our culture. So how do you measure the changes that have to occur in white folks in order to enable that change? So it's not easy work, but it's work we're really committed to, and we feel that we know we're going to get there, and we will be putting forward some public goals around that effort pretty shortly. But most of the work is really driven by just the dedication to pursuing strategies that and measuring whether or not they're effective, and if they don't, you got to figure something else out. But we've got a lot of interesting things going on around, say, how can we get more Black franchisees into our system? What are the barriers that they face? How do we help them overcome that? What's the role we need to play in that, and so forth? So it's exciting work, challenging to be sure, but work that I think is very meaningful to be a part of.
Thank you, Dave. Thanks for taking us through the history, what you're doing now, what's working, what you hope to accomplish in the future. So I think for those who have been listening, who have been watching, the key is to figure out what is important to you. What do you value as an individual, as an institution, and focus on that, and then hopefully that change will come there. I will add 2 little reading notes. You can, Dave, you talked about conflict and discourse. So Conflict is Not Abuse is a great book. I've been reading that, as well as those who want to know more about what's happening in Grand Rapids and some of the history is A City Within a City. So it's important to know what has been in our past so we can continue to make change as we move forward. So now I'm gonna turn it back. So thank you, Dave. I'm gonna give you some virtual claps and appreciate this, especially on a Monday morning. But I'm gonna turn over to Hannah and gonna take us through some of the questions that we have from our audience.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, everybody, for joining us for this dialogue. And we have a few questions from our prepared questions from our partners. And the first one comes from one of our incredible leaders here in West Michigan, Ana Jose, with the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. And what advice, Dave and Milinda both, and what advice would you give to business owners who, given the climate of this last year, are trying to keep their doors open while also building in environmental and social justice practices at the same time?
I'll let Dave go first.
Well, certainly what we have found over our time is that there doesn't have to be a conflict between these kinds of aspirations and achieving business success. And we all always have to balance a lot of different considerations, and you're not always able to do everything at once. But in the end, what we found is that when we are pursuing policies that can try to achieve this idea of linked prosperity, for example, where the folks in our value chain are sharing in our success, that they have ultimately led the business to prosper. But we always, and particularly now, are having to make very hard choices. And I think that sort of blanket sort of advice or value statement doesn't necessarily guide you to any specific choice. But I do think that what we're seeing is that businesses that aren't successful at finding a way to incorporate their values into their business in a very real way are not going to be around very long to thrive.
I would add, Dave, you talked about that linked prosperity, that shared prosperity, and is figuring out those who are alongside you, right? Is sometimes it feels hard to be the only person. Is anybody else facing these challenges? Am I out here alone? And so I think about, sort of my culture and being Latina, shared leadership and our cultural axiology of like a member to member, you're seeing one another. It's not about an ultimate goal, or it's not individualistic. And so when we can bring in those aspects into our business world, I think that has been what's been the most successful. I think also just being honest when we need breaks. We had high levels of burnout already, but really making sure that we're taking care of ourselves and honoring that with one another, checking in on one another, I think is also key. And then lastly is, I think what Dave said before, is just remember that these are not sprints, these are marathons. And so if you need to take a little, I don't do marathons, but if you need to take a little break to do that, to tell people like I am, like I've seen these awesome out of offices, like I am out and I'm not responding because I am protecting my mental well-being. And so just really saying those things and naming it. I mean, this weekend, I had to keep telling myself, stop feeling guilty about not doing 3 things that I kind of could have done. But as Hannah mentioned, I'm in the midst of a pretty significant job transition, career transition. And I'm like, I'm going to hold the space for myself. But I'll tell you, I felt guilty at least 3 different times on Saturday. So just remembering those things. And thank you for that question, Anna.
Yeah, absolutely. Our next question comes from one of People First Economy's stellar staffers, Kathleen Rourke. So this question is for Dave to start. As a global company with a global footprint, who also values the concept of linked prosperity, how does Ben & Jerry's address place-based and localized supply chain within either your franchisees or within your headquarters? Is that something that is baked into your purchasing decisions and so forth?
Yeah, that's a good question. As we've grown, it's of course become increasingly difficult. I mean, we are the world's largest super premium brand of ice cream, and so when we're turning out that kind of volume, it is increasingly difficult to sort of think about Vermont sourcing, for example, locally. Although most of our dairy still does come from Vermont family farms. And that's always been an important aspect of what we do. We also make ice cream in Europe, and the dairy comes from a set of 2 or 3 co-ops in the Netherlands and one in Germany. We're now making ice cream in the UK, so the dairy comes from there. But most of the ingredients that go in as inclusions are they're global supply chains. What we try to do is focus in on the communities where in those supply chains where we buy. So for cocoa, we're working extensively with communities in Cote d'Ivoire which supply our cocoa to help them really achieve that linked prosperity that we talked about. We committed to paying not just fair trade premiums, which we've been doing for a number of years, but to living wage premiums on top of that, which is the amount that if we were the only customer buying their cocoa, if they could sell at that price, they'd be having a decent livelihood. But also working with them to diversify their streams of livelihood. We've got projects going on to increase their climate resilience as they reduce the carbon footprint in their communities. And we actually view that as a part of our work to reduce our own carbon footprint, which is mostly in upstream in our sourcing. So we have a lot of sort of different sorts of programs focused on different communities around the world where we do our sourcing. And then we also do things like, source the brownies or cookies or other kind of inclusions in the sundaes that our scoop shops make locally. And there's a lot of effort that goes into working with values aligned companies for those kinds of ingredients. So those are some of the ways that we do it.
Oh, excellent. Thank you so much for sharing. It's a really important component of the work to consider that supply chain, whether it's intentionally local or intentionally thoughtful and conscious, the way that you've described. It's something that we work towards, and that voting with your dollar doesn't just happen from the consumer side of things, it also happens from the business side of things as well. Our next question comes from one of our student partners, Micah Carroll from Northern Michigan University, all the way up in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, has a great question. He's getting ready to graduate, and as an individual coming out of the university setting, wanting to work for a B Corp or a business that celebrates and operates with these values, such as B Corps. What would you say, Dave, and Milinda as well, to folks who think that operating with social justice values and environmental justice values is a market solution, a market-created or a market-based solution for a market-created problem? What would be your response to that?
A market-created problem, market-based solution for a market-created problem? That's really interesting.
Yeah, that was an interesting question from our university, but I think the intention is just kind of, well, if a lot of folks think capitalism at times can be the root of some of these inequities, and so as a business, who's fighting against that? Yeah.
Well, I would say, that's a really good point, and as much as businesses can do a lot in their own behavior and practices to make a difference, there's no substitute for going after the systemic changes that need to be had to be part of those solutions. I mean, over the past decade or so, you've had all kinds of companies setting science-based targets for greenhouse gas reduction, or talking about becoming carbon neutral. At the same time, climate change is getting worse. Emissions are not going down. You've got all kinds of companies talking about their sustainable packaging when the rate of plastic waste going into the ocean is increasing to the point where, by I think it's at 2050, we're going to have there'll be more plastic in the ocean by weight than fish. So these problems cannot be solved by business practices alone. We have to work together on the policy changes that are needed for systemic solutions. And so I think that's part of what businesses that want to be responsible citizens really have to learn to do. You have a lot of companies that are talking about their sustainable practices, but their lobbyists are actually working exactly in the opposite direction against the solutions to those problems that they say they're trying to solve internally. And so, people like the questioner need to demand that their employers actually align all of their efforts with their values and not just speak out both sides of their mouth.
Yeah, I would also add that we all have a place in this, right? And so one of my good friends has always talked about, you're going to need people who are activists, you're going to need people who are inside organizations or institutions, you're going to need individuals who are writing, like the importance of local journalism and ideas that are coming out into our community. And so to Micah, to the writer of the question, I think is to figure out your spot and to say, what can I do? I've decided to do inside policy change with the city of Grand Rapids, and sometimes I get frustrated, sometimes I want to see change much quicker, and I have to say, okay, this is the path that I've decided where I can do the best good, and wanting others to be around me to really hold me accountable as well. And so I think find your spot, and it sounds like you've got certainly a good future ahead of you, and we need more people who are thinking about that are coming out of our universities, that are coming out of our schools, that are hopefully changing what we think as radical. I think that's the key of it, is none of what we talked about is radical. It's really about caring for our community, caring for our people, caring for humanity. And when we center humanity, I think we'll get that shared prosperity for all.
Great point.
So I think we've actually reached the end of our time. So Dave, we've kept the conversation going. We've talked about a variety of things, and I just want to say thank you so much for coming in virtually into Grand Rapids and spending a little time with Hannah and I this morning, and all of those that have been watching and listening online. This is the benefit of COVID, right? Is we can connect in ways that we might have not ever thought of possibly, and that the decisions to bring people in are not binary. We can have this virtual Zoom and welcome somebody like Dave into the conversation. So thanks so much, Dave.
Oh, thank you. It's really been a great conversation. Thanks for your end of it. It's been terrific.
Great. I'm going to turn over to Hannah just to close us out for this morning.
Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us, to Dave and Milinda for keeping the conversation going and really touching on some of the most integral issues that we're facing here in our communities today. I want to thank our statewide partners. It's an honor for People First Economy to be able to do more regional and statewide work because of technology and the ways that it connects us. If you're interested in learning more, we do have an event, a free event for business leaders later on today. So check out the People First or Good for Michigan websites or our social media to find out more about that event, to dig more into how your business can honor the values, like Ben & Jerry's can honor the values of our communities and work towards this kind of collective prosperity. And again, People First Economy is the convener of B corporations, B Corps in the state of Michigan as well. So if you want to learn more about that, please don't hesitate to reach out to us, and the information will be in the slideshow and on our social media pages and our websites as well. But thank you all so much for joining us, to Milinda and Dave once again, to Triumph Music Academy for helping us produce this wonderful event. It's been an honor to spend the morning with you all on a Monday. So thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day.